Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. And again, it's a great pleasure to come to Paris and to be here at ULIP. I really liked the way we can engage with this seminar series, and especially when you asked me, okay, what would you like to do? I was like, well, migration is definitely an area where we can actually have a nice discussion and try to understand what has happened with the so-called migration and refugee crisis. And I immediately thought about my colleague Noha El-Kadim as well, to try to have a conversation with you on how we can have a different perspective on this crisis and try to, I think, decenter our traditional Eurocentric look on the way the crisis has unfolded. So I have a couple of slides, and at the end of this presentation, which highlights a few of my main arguments, but also ties in some research I've been doing since 2004-2005 on EU migration, migration and border policies. I have a short documentary to show you. It's a 5-minute teaser of a documentary where with a colleague who's a Moroccan anthropologist, Aziz Haloua, we are interviewing migrants to get their own stories and their own personal perspective. The work has been done mostly for the moment in Ceuta and Melilla, two Spanish enclaves on the Moroccan territory. And we are about to have a new phase of filming and interviewing, which will take place in Calais. So it's a premiere tonight to show this teaser. So I mean, it's a really rough teaser and rough cut. And of course, it's only the first phase of the movie, but I think it will maybe provoke some reactions and questions. But for the moment, I just wanted to start with the idea that, or the argument that traditionally, and especially with the recent crisis, the Mediterranean has been transformed and seen and described in the media, but also by policymakers as a space of crisis. You have here a quote from the High Representative for EU Foreign and Security Policy, Federica Mogherini. She says that the Mediterranean is today the center of the world. It is the most problematic region in the world and still the least integrated in the world, but also referring to migration and more broadly a conflict area. I think this kind of quotes and you can go through a discourse analysis of all these documents, you will find that it suggests discontinuity and it creates moral geographies on the region. And when it comes to migrants, about which migrants are good, which migrants are bad. You speak about bona fide migrants nowadays as well from a legal perspective. And I think it conceals how we got there, and maybe also a bit the responsibility of the European Union, European member states, into how we got there to this situation nowadays. Indeed, my argument is that, and it's based on an article I have co-authored with another colleague, where we highlight how population movements have been traditionally and historically quite common in the Mediterranean up until the 70s, and it's only recently that we have this space of crisis and immobilities in the Mediterranean. So it has never been so restricted than today. And of course you have these images that you have seen, all over the media, the news, about how dramatic was the situation, and these flows of people and number of people who were sort of invading and coming to Europe. You have also seen a lot of maps about migration routes to Europe. We had, in the previous session, Nora had a very good explanation. I realized we had common maps, and mapping, she was saying, is not a neutral exercise. It actually has some political meaning behind it. But again, these kind of maps have been used a lot to show how migrants were getting to the European Union. They are also clustered in administrative categories by Frontex, which is an agency that you might have heard about. So you have the Western Mediterranean, Central Mediterranean, Western Balkan route, Eastern Mediterranean, and numbers are aggregated. And then you have, of course, definitely a rise of numbers, especially since 2014, through the Central Mediterranean route. You see an increasing number of people, so you see we reach about 200,000 people trying to cross, being detected on the Central Mediterranean route. A novelty during the crisis was that the Western Balkans were confronted as well to new flows of migrants. Again, you have about, in 2016, 122,000, 23,000 migrants going through the Western Balkan route, and therefore asking some Eastern European countries to also take their share of managing migration, which they were not used to. But these numbers and these maps also conceals another reality, which is that migrants die at sea. We all know it, but this has been a kind of counter-narrative that has also been framed and been communicated about by NGOs as well, to counter this security approach of the European Union and its member states. So here you have a map, it's from IOM, and you can clearly see that the European Union has become the deadliest stretch of water in the world. Many NGOs, many international organizations have been calling upon the European Union. I think even the Pope Francis called upon the European Union to be more, to have more moral spirit about that and do something. Here you see the data. In the Mediterranean, and here I have the data for 2017 and 2018. You can actually go on this Missing Migrants project on IOM, and you will see daily updates, unfortunately. So what is interesting is that having first started out with framing the crisis as a security issue, then having a counter-narrative from civil society NGOs highlighting the fact that migrants were actually risking their lives, and then the European Union started to frame another narrative about migration as the new normal, and
we need more Europe in our asylum policy. We need more union in our refugee policy. Il s'agit de solidarité partagée. J'en ai assez des poèmes. Ich mag Betroffenheitsrhetorik am Anfang. In 6 Monaten wird die öffentliche Meinung sich wieder in eine andere Richtung bewegen. We have started to see solidarity. I'm convinced much more solidarity is needed. I also know that solidarity must be voluntary. It must come from the heart.
So this is obviously messaging from the European Union about their role in the crisis and As you can see, the framing is really into how much money has been spent, how they have encouraged development aid, how also there is this new narrative about saving lives, which has emerged during the crisis, with Frontex not being about only doing border surveillance, but rescuing people at sea. And you have also these numbers about, being showing solidarity and relocating migrants within the European Union. So migrants who have arrived through Italy and Greece. The Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said, well, we will relocate 160,000 migrants. It was an agreement with EU member states, and you can see that out of the 160,000 migrants, at the time of the video, 13,000 had been relocated, which is not much. It has been a bit more. We're getting more towards 30,000 and plus at the moment, but it's really a minority. So basically, I just wanted to confront this narrative of the European Union to the reality of migration and mobility. And basically, here you have just another way to look at migration in the world as a global issue, as something that is, a normal phenomenon, of course, with globalization. And I think compared to all what the European Union is doing, and sometimes with difficulties due to vested interest from EU member states who have different labor markets, different needs, different policies as well, it's important to understand that the trend overall globally is that migration flows south-north are declining, and actually the flows south-south are actually increasing. And south-south migration flows are also, or the type of flows and the way people just move worldwide is being increasingly motivated by growing inequalities. Social and economic inequalities are one of the main drivers of migration. Also, when we hear about refugees coming to Europe, we have to put it in the perspective that 86% of refugees are being hosted by the South. So what we have witnessed in Europe is just one small experience into what the rest of the world is actually confronted regularly, and that migration is a normal phenomenon of world politics in general.
How do you read the map?
Sorry? Oh, it's just a map that has been done. So you can go on, I have the source, I don't know if the slides will be circulated, but it's called the Social Change Initiative, and it's basically a word cloud, I think, that has been integrated into a map and into how you define people have been asked how they define migration by choice, by move, sometimes statelessness, and so on. So if you want to know more, you can go on their website. It's, of course, I use it for illustrative purposes, and we have to check how the data has been used to cluster the words into that. But basically, my main, also more theoretical argument, I think we need to have a different views on the geopolitics of migration, and maybe a critical approach to geopolitics of migration, or what we have talked about in the seminar before, kind of decentric approach. Of course, often migration is in the middle of traditional geopolitics because it's about power, it's about competition, and it has a state-centric focus. But I think two aspects, and we see also that countries such as Turkey and the current regime are also playing a game vis-a-vis the European Union, trying to also get their interest across as well when it comes to migration. So migrants become a bargaining chip, if you want, within a geopolitical game of migration. But I think there are two ways you can look at geopolitics and migration. The first one that has been suggested is to look at the geopolitics of mobility, that you focus on what kind of techniques are used by government to control, to manage migration, and these geopolitics of mobility create consequences, unintended or intended consequences that we need to analyze. Another way is also to just focus on migrants, and just to consider that migrants are not only victims, they are not only criminals, but they are also able to be active agents of their own mobility, and they shape and reshape geopolitics and policies through their own practices of mobility. And you have examples, if you're interested to look into remittances, transnational collective action, court cases that have been launched as well by migrants. I think overall the idea is basically, and here you have, it's more representative of the North American, Mexican border, of course, but the idea is that I think EU bordering and asylum policies and practices influence and shape political geographies. They create, again, moral geographies, they create exceptional spaces. It's spaces, refugee camps become spaces of social formation and can be also instrumentalized. And here actually I just wanted to mention the work of Elena Fidian-Casmier in this related to how also sometimes the West also construct what we expect from refugees and migrants. And she has this whole book about how some Sahrawi in Western Sahara, Sahrawi refugees have actually themselves built a certain image vis-a-vis Western donors to get aid and to get political help for their own nationalist fight and struggle. So we do have a role to play in the way we manage migration. It's not only about numbers, it's not only about borders, but it's about the kind of new spatialization it can create and moral geographies. Just to label a third country to be a safe third country that's also participating to this kind of governmentality techniques. Another point I wanted to raise, and I've made earlier, is that by framing the Mediterranean as a space of crisis, we are forgetting about the history of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean has been a space of mobility. You can go back to Fernand Braudel and you know the history of the Mediterranean, but more recently, actually, if you look at the way in the post-Second World War mobility was happening around the Mediterranean, it was much easier than nowadays. It was much easier, of course, for North African citizens to come to Europe. Also, later on, you had, it's interesting to see that southern EU member states, such as Spain, Italy, or Greece, also needed migrants for their own economies. And they started to attract a lot of Maghreb immigrants to come and work. The change happened then in the 90s when you had much more restrictive policies, and these restrictive policies have actually also contributed to create irregular migration, because migrants didn't have means to travel freely and legally to Europe, so they stayed irregular, illegal, and they contributed still to the shadow economies of these southern European countries, but also, I mean, we can think about France. I mean, we are here, and that's the case as well. Again, just coming back also on the history, refugee flows in the Mediterranean are not new. We can think about the Western Saharan conflict that has created movements of people, but also, of course, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that produced 5 million refugees, and most of them are still refugees in the region. So I think we need to take this perspective into account, and that's a picture from a camp in Lebanon, and just to show you how indeed the numbers due to the Syrian conflict have increased incredibly, and that actually it's not necessarily Europe that has been most confronted to refugees, but countries in the south, Jordan, Lebanon, that have to share resources, basic resources such as water, education, access to health with refugees, and that creates also tension. So I think it's important to challenge conventional assumptions within the practice of migration policies, but also in the way we try to understand and to analyze migration in academia, and I hope this can inform as well policy making, and that we need to take into account history, the individual migrants' perspective, but also third countries' perspective when we're designing EU policies or global policies. It's not only about Eurocentric interest, but in the long term it would make sense to take into account also third countries and third country citizens' interest. I think that's it. I will end here. If you have any question, I think we'll have a Q&A session later on. Thank you.